A wealthy businessman in Boston thought his mansion was filled with comfort and success, until one afternoon he returned home early and froze at what he saw. His little daughter sat in her wheelchair, her tiny hands red and trembling with pain, whispering, "Daddy, it hurts." Beside her, a loyal German shepherd stood guard, growling at the cruel stepmother who had hidden her true face for far too long. What was uncovered inside that house would shatter illusions, ignite a courtroom battle, and reveal the quiet miracles that only love and God's grace can bring. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. And if you believe every child deserves safety, kindness, and a second chance, hit that subscribe button, because this story may change the way you see family forever. The late autumn air in Boston carried a sharp chill, the kind that crept beneath coats and brushed against cheeks with a bite both crisp and invigorating. Leaves along Commonwealth Avenue had already turned golden, and the city's stately brownstones stood beneath a gray sky heavy with the promise of rain. In the upscale neighborhood of Beacon Hill, where wrought iron fences guarded manicured gardens and cobblestone paths glistened from earlier drizzle, stood the Coleman Mansion, a towering house of glass and stone, elegant yet strangely silent. The house reflected wealth in every corner, from the tall bay windows to the marble steps at the entrance, but it lacked the warmth that usually marked a home. Inside lived Richard Coleman, a man of 42 whose reputation had made him one of Boston's most talked-about figures. Richard was tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly combed sandy brown hair beginning to gray at the temples. His hazel eyes were sharp, the kind that once captivated investors in boardrooms, but in recent years they had grown heavy with shadows of regret. A tech entrepreneur who had founded a major electronics company, he had the calm, deliberate demeanor of someone accustomed to making decisions worth millions. Yet when it came to his private life, Richard carried a burden of sorrow. 2 years earlier, a car accident had claimed the life of his wife, leaving him to raise their only daughter alone. That tragedy had shaped him, hardening his focus on work as if burying himself in business could numb the emptiness that lingered each time he returned home. His daughter, Emily Coleman, was only 6. She had inherited her late mother's delicate features, soft brown hair that fell in wisps across her forehead, wide chestnut eyes that often looked older than her years, and a smile that now rarely appeared. The accident that killed her mother had also left Emily paralyzed from the waist down. She sat in a wheelchair, small hands folded in her lap, always gazing at the world from a height lower than those around her. Once she had been a lively child who loved to run barefoot through the garden, chasing butterflies and calling out, "Daddy, Mommy," when Richard came home. But since the accident, her laughter had been replaced by silence. Her only solace was the grand piano by the living room window, ivory-colored and once played with passion by her mother. Emily touched its keys as if touching her mother's memory. Then there was Melissa Coleman, Richard's second wife, who entered the family only a year ago. At first glance, Melissa appeared every inch the gracious hostess. She was 31, tall and slender, with cascading dark hair that gleamed beneath the light and a poised elegance perfected by years of social ambition. Her features' arched brows, almond-shaped eyes, and a perpetual soft smile gave the impression of refinement. To outsiders, she seemed warm, attentive, even maternal toward Emily. But beneath the polished exterior lay a calculating, self-centered woman whose marriage to Richard was motivated less by love and more by status and comfort. Melissa disliked responsibility, and the presence of a stepdaughter in a wheelchair felt like a blemish on the image of the perfect life she sought to portray. This resentment simmered beneath her outward sweetness, unseen by Richard but felt keenly by Emily. The fourth member of the household was Max, a German shepherd 6 years old, with a strong, muscular frame, sleek black and tan coat, and amber eyes that glowed with a mix of intelligence and loyalty. Max had once been trained as a rescue dog, his instincts sharp and protective. Since moving into the mansion, he had bonded with Emily instantly, becoming her guardian and constant companion. He would rest his head gently on her lap when she played piano, and at night he lay by her wheelchair as if keeping vigil. Max was wary of Melissa. Whenever she drew too close to Emily, his ears pricked and a low growl rumbled from his chest. His presence was both a comfort to Emily and an irritation to Melissa, who considered him an obstacle she longed to remove. On that particular afternoon, the mansion was unusually quiet. Richard had just returned from another business trip. He walked through the spacious foyer, his leather shoes tapping against polished oak floors, and called out a hurried greeting before rushing to his study. His phone was pressed to his ear, his briefcase still in hand. Richard rarely lingered with Emily when work demanded his attention. He loved his daughter deeply, but the demands of his company and perhaps his own avoidance of painful memories often pulled him away. To Emily, his absences felt like abandonment. She longed for him to sit beside her, to hold her the way he had before the accident, but her pleas rarely reached his ears. Melissa appeared in the hallway, smiling warmly as Richard disappeared behind the study doors. She wore a cream-colored dress that accentuated her graceful figure, her jewelry glinting softly in the chandelier light. "Richard, don't worry. I'll make sure Emily has lunch," she called sweetly. Richard gave a distracted nod without looking back. As soon as his door clicked shut, Melissa's expression changed. The smile slipped from her lips, replaced by a look of cold irritation. She glanced toward the living room, where Emily sat quietly at the piano, fingers resting on the keys, though no sound emerged. Max was at her side, his head lifted, ears twitching. "Emily," Melissa said, her tone clipped now that no one else was listening. "You shouldn't sit there all day. It's time you did something useful." Emily looked up timidly, but her gaze quickly dropped back to her lap. She whispered almost inaudibly, "I just want to play." Melissa's eyes narrowed. "You heard me. The piano will still be here later." She turned sharply on her heel and strode toward the kitchen, her heels clicking across the floor. Max followed her with his eyes, a soft growl escaping his throat. Emily's fingers trembled as she touched the piano again, pressing a single note that rang weakly in the vast room. The sound reminded her of her mother Charlotte, whose memory still lingered in the ivory keys. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, afraid Melissa might notice and scold her. Outside the window, the sky grew darker with the promise of rain. Across the street, Linda Parker, a retired schoolteacher in her late 60s, passed by on her daily walk. Linda was a short, sturdy woman with kind gray eyes and silver hair tied neatly in a bun. She had taught generations of neighborhood children and carried herself with quiet dignity. Since retirement, she often strolled past the Coleman mansion, curious about the family that lived within. Linda had noticed the girl in the wheelchair many times, always sitting alone by the piano. Today, as she paused to rest her cane against the garden fence, she saw the same image, Emily staring longingly at the keys, Max pressed close to her side. A pang of concern tugged at Linda's heart, though she told herself it was not her place to interfere. Still, something about the girl's solemn eyes troubled her. Rain began to fall, tapping softly against the tall windows of the mansion. Emily reached out, her small hand resting on Max's fur, drawing comfort from his steady warmth. She whispered, almost too soft to hear, "I wish Mommy was here." Max pressed closer, his amber eyes fixed protectively on her. In that quiet moment, beneath the shadow of wealth and silence, the first hints of a hidden struggle began to stir, a struggle no amount of marble or money could conceal, and thus, within the grand house in Boston, the stage was set. A father too often absent, a stepmother hiding cruelty behind a smile, a lonely child aching for love, and a loyal dog who would stand guard through it all. The next morning dawned in Boston under a sky still heavy with gray clouds. The rain from the night before had left the streets slick and reflective, tiny puddles gathering along the sidewalks of Beacon Hill. The air was crisp, scented faintly with wet stone and autumn leaves, and inside the Coleman mansion the silence was broken only by the faint ticking of an antique clock in the hallway. Emily sat in her wheelchair near the living room window, Max curled faithfully at her side. The piano stood close by, its ivory keys glistening faintly in the morning light, like a promise waiting to be touched. Yet Emily dared not play. She could still hear Melissa's sharp voice from the day before echoing in her ears. Melissa descended the wide staircase in a silk robe the color of deep wine, her dark hair perfectly brushed even at that early hour. She paused midway, looking down at the girl and the dog with cool eyes. Her lips curved into a smile, but it was thin, hollow, nothing like the warm expression she used in front of Richard. "Good morning, Emily," she said sweetly, though her tone carried an edge. "Your father left early, another trip. That means you and I will spend the day together." The words, to most, might have sounded comforting, To Emily, they landed like a stone in her chest. After breakfast, Melissa set down a laundry basket in front of Emily's wheelchair. The basket was full of bed sheets and towels, heavy with dampness. "You need to help with these," Melissa said briskly. Emily's hands twitched. The skin was still sore from previous scrubbing, faint patches of red visible across her knuckles. She looked up timidly. "My hands hurt. I don't think I can." Melissa leaned closer, her perfume cloying, her smile frozen. "Stop pretending, Emily. You're not as fragile as you think. If you don't finish this, you won't touch that piano again." Max rose instantly, ears pricked, his body tensing as a growl rolled from his chest. Melissa whipped her head toward him, eyes flashing. "Quiet, mutt!" she snapped, snatching a rolled newspaper from the counter and swatting it in his direction. Max retreated only a step, his amber eyes never leaving her, protective and unyielding. Emily lowered her gaze, lifted the first towel with trembling fingers, and dragged it toward the basin in the kitchen. Melissa filled it with cold water, poured in harsh soap, and handed Emily a brush nearly too large for her small hands. "Work properly," Melissa ordered. "No one likes a useless girl." Hours dragged by. Emily scrubbed until her fingers were raw, the water stinging each scratch. Foam clung to her wrists, soaking into her sleeves. Max hovered beside her, sometimes resting his nose against her arm as if urging her to stop. The girl bit her lip hard to keep from crying, but tears welled anyway, splashing into the soapy water. Just then the doorbell rang. Melissa stiffened, tossed the brush aside, and straightened her robe. "Stay here," she ordered sharply. She swept through the hallway and opened the grand front door to reveal Caroline Young, a middle-aged housekeeper who came twice a week. Caroline was in her late 40s, short and slightly plump, with curly auburn hair escaping the bun at the back of her head. Her face bore lines of kindness, but also worry. Life as a single mother of 3 had not been easy, and it made her both hardworking and fiercely protective of children. "Morning, Mrs. Coleman," Caroline said, her tone polite but tired. She carried a small satchel with cleaning supplies. Melissa plastered on her sweetest smile. "Caroline, you're early today. Come in, I was just about to have Emily help me with some chores. You know, it's important for her to learn responsibility." Caroline's brow furrowed faintly. She had seen Emily before, always quiet, always pale. Something in Melissa's voice unsettled her. But she nodded and went about dusting the shelves, her eyes drifting toward the kitchen whenever she could. Inside, Emily was struggling with the laundry. Caroline's heart tightened at the sight of the little girl's reddened hands and the loyal dog watching anxiously. She bent down beside Emily, lowering her voice. "Sweetheart, let me take that," she whispered gently. Emily glanced up, eyes wide with gratitude, but before she could answer, Melissa's heels clicked sharply against the tile. "Caroline," Melissa said firmly, "don't coddle her. She needs to learn. Please focus on your own work." Caroline straightened, forcing a smile, but inside her suspicion grew stronger. The hours stretched into afternoon. Melissa, dressed now in a sleek yellow dress, sipped tea by the window, watching Emily labor. Every now and then she called out small insults. "You're too slow. Do you want me to tell your father you're lazy?" Max growled low each time, but Melissa ignored him. Emily's shoulders sagged under the weight of exhaustion. Caroline eventually excused herself, muttering something about groceries, but as she left, she cast one last glance at Emily. Her instincts as a mother screamed that something was wrong. She resolved silently to keep an eye on the situation, even if it meant risking her job. By early evening, the mansion's bright chandeliers were lit, their glow reflecting off the polished wood floors. Emily slumped in her wheelchair, hands raw and trembling. Melissa tossed a red silk dress onto the floor in front of her. "Wash this again," she ordered coldly. "Last time it wasn't clean enough." Emily's chestnut eyes brimmed with tears. She whispered, "Please, my hands burn." Melissa's lips curled in disdain. "Then maybe you should try harder. Otherwise, say goodbye to your piano." The dress's color struck Emily deeply. She remembered her mother wearing a similar red gown during a recital, her face radiant under the lights. The memory stabbed like a knife, and the contrast between that warmth and Melissa's cruelty made her sob quietly. She picked up the dress anyway, her fingers shaking. The soap stung her cuts, forcing small whimpers from her throat. Melissa turned away, satisfied, sipping her tea in triumph. But Max had seen enough. He padded forward, placed his body between Emily and the basin, and stared directly at Melissa, teeth bared. The air in the kitchen grew taut, a silent standoff between loyalty and malice. Melissa glared, but something in the dog's eyes unsettled her. For a moment, she faltered, then hissed, "Move, you beast!" Emily clutched Max's fur, burying her face against his shoulder. "Don't go, Max," she whispered brokenly. Tears streaked her cheeks as the room blurred before her. She wished her father would walk through the door, wished someone would rescue her from the nightmare. Instead, only Melissa's heels echoed across the floor as she stormed away. The night deepened. Rain began again outside, rattling softly against the windows. In the kitchen, Emily sat weakly in her chair. Max pressed close, both of them framed in the glow of a single lamp. Above them, the grand mansion loomed as cold as stone, and within its walls the cruelty that had been hidden behind smiles was now laid bare. Boston awoke under low, brooding clouds, the city's streets rinsed clean by the storm that had swept through the night. The air carried the metallic tang of rain on stone, and the brick facades of Beacon Hill gleamed darkly against the gray sky. Inside the Coleman mansion, the silence was almost oppressive. Emily sat slumped in her wheelchair, her small hands resting limp in her lap, the skin raw and tender from hours of forced chores. Max had stayed at her side all night, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, his ears twitching whenever Melissa walked past. The dog's protective presence was the only barrier between the child and further cruelty. Richard Coleman returned earlier than expected, a twist of fate shifting his plans. His sedan glided up the slick street, headlights cutting through the drizzle. The man who stepped out looked composed to passers-by, tall, broad-shouldered, his coat neat, his tie loose, but his chest carried an ache he could no longer ignore. He thought of his daughter's frail voice before his last trip, whispering for him not to leave again. That whisper still gnawed at him as he opened the heavy front door. What he saw inside tore through the thin wall of denial he had built. Emily, pale and trembling, clutched her lap, her eyes swollen from crying. Max stood firmly between her and Melissa, his teeth bared. Melissa, immaculate in her yellow dress, spun around, startled by Richard's sudden presence. For a brief instant, fear crossed her face before she forced it away with a brittle smile. "Richard, you're home early. I was just—" But she faltered under his gaze. His hazel eyes, usually calm, now burned with a rage that pinned her in place. He said nothing at first. Instead, he strode forward, knelt, and gathered Emily carefully into his arms. She whimpered, her bandaged fingers curling weakly into his suit jacket. "Daddy, my hands. They hurt," she whispered. His throat constricted, shame pressing hard against his ribs. He turned and carried her out without a word to Melissa. Max followed, close enough that his fur brushed Richard's leg as though ready to spring at any sign of threat. The drive through the damp streets was tense. Emily's soft sobs punctuated the hum of the engine. Max pressed against her side in the back seat, his presence steady, anchoring her. Richard's jaw tightened with every mile. He had ignored too much, for too long. At Yale New Haven Hospital, the sterile brightness of the pediatric ward contrasted with the gloom outside. Nurses moved quickly, and Richard was ushered into an examination room. Dr. Susan Harris, stern but compassionate, examined Emily's hands and confirmed what Richard already feared: prolonged abuse. As the doctor dictated her notes sharply to the nurse, the door opened again. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, summoned after a report had been filed earlier that morning. Sergeant Paul Whitaker, in his early 40s, had a stocky build, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that missed little. He carried himself with the quiet gravity of a man who had seen too many domestic disputes turn tragic. His partner, Officer Naomi Chen, younger by a decade, had sharp black hair cut just above her shoulders and a notebook already in her hand. Naomi was calm, efficient, her expression betraying neither judgment nor surprise. "Mr. Coleman?" Sergeant Whitaker asked, his voice even. Richard straightened, still holding Emily's uninjured hand. "Yes," he answered, his tone hoarse. Whitaker nodded toward Dr. Harris. "We've been told the injuries are consistent with abuse. We'll need a statement." Emily's wide eyes darted to the officers, fear flickering in her expression. Max growled low, positioning himself between the officers and the bed. Naomi crouched slightly, softening her voice. "Easy, boy. We're not here to hurt her." The German shepherd's growl eased into a whine, but his eyes never left them. Richard stroked the dog's neck, murmuring, "It's all right, Max." Officer Chen approached Emily carefully, her notebook open. "Sweetheart, can you tell me what happened to your hands?" Emily looked down, silent at first, then whispered, She made me wash and scrub until it burned." The words trembled out, fragile but steady enough to make Whitaker exchange a grave glance with the doctor. Naomi scribbled quickly, her neat handwriting filling the page. Richard gave his own account, describing what he had walked in on. His voice trembled with fury as he spoke, each word sharp, and Whitaker noted everything in his pad. "We'll also need to confirm with your neighbor," Whitaker added. "A Mrs. Parker called this morning about unusual cries from the house. That corroborates what we see here." Linda Parker herself arrived at the hospital soon after, cane in hand, her eyes scanning anxiously until she saw Emily. The retired teacher's expression softened as she approached, nodding firmly to the officers. "I told you," she said to Whitaker, "that child needed help." Her voice carried the conviction of a woman who had spent decades protecting children in classrooms, unwilling to turn away now. The officers stepped aside with Richard, lowering their voices. Whitaker's tone was steady but firm. "We'll file for immediate protective oversight. Until a judge reviews this, we'll have patrol cars keep an eye on your property. You may want to remove yourself and your daughter from that house." Richard nodded, the weight of their words pressing down but also offering a thread of relief. Meanwhile, Naomi Chen bent down to Emily's level again. "You're very brave for telling us," she said softly. "You did the right thing. We'll make sure you're safe." Emily gave a faint nod, clutching Max's fur for reassurance. The German shepherd licked her arm gently, as though sealing the promise. As dusk crept across Boston, Richard sat alone in the waiting area, his head in his hands. The day had stripped away every illusion, leaving only guilt and resolve. Through the glass window he could see Emily asleep, her small chest rising steadily, Max curled protectively at her side. A nurse adjusted the IV line while Officer Chen remained nearby, writing her report with methodical focus. Richard lifted his head at last, his jaw set. This would not end quietly. Melissa's mask had cracked, and now the law itself was moving. He vowed silently, fiercely, he would never let Emily suffer again. The storm outside had quieted, but within the Coleman family, another was about to erupt, one that would be fought not in whispers but in courts and under the watchful eyes of justice. The following week dawned with crisp air sweeping through Boston, the kind of autumn morning when sunlight gleamed cold and clear on the city's historic courthouse. Reporters clustered at the wide stone steps, microphones and cameras bristling like weapons of curiosity. The Coleman case had become the center of public attention, whispers of wealth, betrayal, and child abuse drawing in both journalists and bystanders. Richard Coleman stepped out of a black sedan, dressed in a navy suit, his face lined with fatigue but sharpened by resolve. In his arms he carried Emily, her hands carefully bandaged, her small frame wrapped in a pale blue dress that made her look fragile yet angelic. Max padded close behind, the 6-year-old German shepherd's black and tan coat gleaming in the sunlight, his ears erect, alert to every sound. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. The high ceiling arched above like a cathedral, and rows of benches filled quickly with citizens, journalists, and legal observers. Judge Raymond Holbrook presided at the bench, a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s with sharp features and deep-set gray eyes. Known for his stern approach and incorruptible reputation, Holbrook's very presence cast a silence over the room. He had once lost his younger brother to domestic violence, a private tragedy that gave him little tolerance for cruelty within families, though he never spoke of it openly. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, Michael Turner, a man in his 40s with neatly combed chestnut hair, a narrow jawline, and a reputation for precision in court. Turner's voice was measured, never theatrical, but his eyes burned with quiet determination whenever he looked at Emily. Across the aisle sat Melissa, dressed in a modest black dress with pearls at her neck. She had styled her dark hair carefully, painted her lips a muted rose, and arranged her features into an expression of frailty. Her lawyer, Harold Bennett, was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with slicked-back gray hair, thick glasses, and a booming voice that often drowned out others. Bennett had a history of twisting narratives in family court to his client's favor, a man admired by some for his cunning and despised by others for the same reason. The gavel cracked. Judge Holbrook's voice filled the room. "This court is now in session. The matter, Richard Coleman versus Melissa Coleman, charges of child abuse and petition for divorce. Turner rose smoothly, his voice steady. Your Honor, my client will prove that his daughter, Emily Coleman, has suffered both physical and emotional abuse at the hands of her stepmother, Melissa Coleman. We have medical testimony, corroborating witnesses, and video evidence. Melissa dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, then glanced briefly at Richard before looking down. Her performance of sorrow was almost convincing, except that Max, sitting quietly at Richard's feet, growled softly whenever her gaze lingered too long. The first witness was called, Dr. Susan Harris. She approached in her crisp white coat, petite frame upright, her expression calm yet unyielding. She testified firmly about the condition of Emily's hands, describing in detail the injuries caused by repeated forced labor in soapy water. Bennett attempted to rattle her with questions, suggesting Emily might have injured herself for attention, but Dr. Harris's sharp eyes pinned him in place. A 6-year-old in a wheelchair cannot self-inflict this pattern of damage, she said coldly. These are clear signs of long-term abuse. Next came Sergeant Paul Whitaker and Officer Naomi Chen, the 2 police officers who had interviewed Emily at the hospital. Whitaker stood squarely, his stocky build solid as stone, and recounted the statements he had taken. Chen, her black hair tied neatly, added her perspective, noting Emily's fear but also her courage in answering questions. Bennett tried to suggest bias, but Chen's composure never faltered. She replied firmly, "We do not side with parents or guardians, we side with evidence." The jury nodded subtly, sensing the weight of honesty in her tone. From the gallery, Linda Parker, the neighbor, was called forward. With her cane tapping against the floor, she described what she had witnessed. Cries echoing from the house, nights when she saw Emily left outside in her wheelchair, hair disheveled, cheeks wet with tears. Her testimony stirred murmurs in the crowd. Though Bennett tried to dismiss her as a busybody neighbor, Linda's piercing eyes silenced him. "I taught children for 35 years, she said. "I know when a child is in pain." When Turner requested that video evidence be shown, the courtroom hushed. On the large monitor, footage from Richard's hidden cameras appeared. Melissa's mask of tenderness gone, replaced by a face contorted in anger as she shouted at Emily, who scrubbed dishes until her small hands bled. Another clip showed Melissa blocking Emily's wheelchair from reaching the piano, threatening to destroy the instrument if she disobeyed. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Melissa's face turned white as she stared at the floor, her fingers gripping her tissue until it tore. Judge Holbrook's jaw tightened as he watched, his eyes narrowing, though his voice remained steady. "Let the record show the footage is entered into evidence." Melissa's lawyer, Bennett, rose with booming indignation. "Your Honor, let us not forget that Mr. Coleman left his daughter for business, allowing these supposed abuses to occur. He is no saint. He is a neglectful father who abandoned his child." He slammed a hand on the table, and murmurs erupted again. Richard clenched his fists, guilt flashing across his face. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then Turner spoke quietly but firmly. "Yes, my client worked long hours. He is guilty of misplaced priorities. But absence is not abuse. What we see on this screen is abuse." His words landed like hammer blows, cutting through Bennett's bluster. Melissa suddenly broke her composure. Her voice rose, shrill and cracking. "That child is useless. She drags everyone down. I gave up everything to take care of her." The outburst stunned even her own lawyer. Gasps filled the courtroom. Max, picking up on the tension, barked sharply, his deep voice echoing in the chamber. Emily reached down instinctively to stroke his head, tears brimming in her eyes. Judge Holbrook slammed his gavel 3 times. "Order! Mrs. Coleman, your words have spoken louder than any testimony." The day's session ended with a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Melissa's mask had slipped, her bitterness laid bare for all to see. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed, Richard, Emily, and Max, cameras flashing. Reporters called out questions, their voices blending into chaos. Richard shielded Emily with his arm while Max pressed close, guiding them through the throng with the silent strength of a guardian. That night, in their temporary apartment near the Charles River, Richard tucked Emily into bed. Max lay curled on the rug beside her wheelchair, his eyes half closed but vigilant. Emily whispered, "Daddy, are we safe now?" Richard kissed her forehead gently. "We're safer than we've ever been, sweetheart. Tomorrow we'll keep fighting. But today, you were so brave." The faint sound of the city drifted through the window horns, footsteps, a distant siren. But within that room, peace lingered. For the first time in years, Emily fell asleep without fear. Richard sat silently, gazing out at the dark river, vowing he would never again let shadows touch his daughter's life. The final gavel had fallen days earlier, yet the echoes of the courtroom still lingered in Richard Coleman's mind. Melissa was in custody awaiting sentencing, her carefully constructed image torn apart by her own venomous words and the irrefutable weight of evidence. The media circus had not ended, however. Every morning, newspapers splashed photos of Emily in her wheelchair beside Richard and Max, headlines alternating between tragedy and triumph. In Boston, Emily's name had become synonymous with resilience. Hashtags calling for child protection reform spread online, but to Richard, the world had narrowed down to one small girl and her loyal dog. Their new life began not in a mansion but in a modest red brick house near the Charles River, where the sound of water and the rustle of maple trees replaced the suffocating silence of wealth. Emily's room had a large window where golden sunlight poured across the keys of her piano, brought over carefully from storage. She sat there one afternoon, her hands still swaddled in light bandages, hesitant to press the keys. Max sprawled at her feet, his 6-year-old frame stretched protectively, his amber eyes following every twitch of her fingers. One afternoon brought a knock at the door. Richard opened it to find Rachel King, a journalist from the New York Times. Rachel was in her late 30s, tall and slender, with auburn hair tied back loosely and intelligent hazel eyes behind thin-framed glasses. She had a calm demeanor, polite but persistent, the kind of reporter who earned people's trust through patience rather than intrusion. Years earlier, she had covered cases of institutional neglect and lost a younger cousin to foster care failings, a personal wound that fueled her determination to shine light on children's stories. She greeted Richard with a soft smile, holding a leather satchel heavy with notes. "Mr. Coleman, thank you for agreeing to speak. I promise my questions won't be for scandal, but for truth. The public deserves to know Emily's voice." Richard hesitated, his protective instinct clashing with his sense of responsibility. Emily wheeled herself into the hallway, Max trotting close. "Daddy, it's okay," she whispered, her eyes large but steady. She was learning that her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to countless children still hidden in shadows. Richard sighed, stepped aside, and let Rachel in. The interview unfolded in their modest living room. Rachel asked gentle questions, speaking directly to Emily rather than through her father. "What makes you feel safe now?" she asked. Emily glanced down at Max, who thumped his tail against the floor, and then at her father. "Because my dad listens now, and Max never leaves." The journalist smiled faintly, jotting her notes with care. For once, Emily felt her words were shaping something larger than herself. Meanwhile, Richard had enrolled Emily in a community therapy group run by Sister Margaret O'Donnell, a nun in her late 50s with graying hair tucked under her habit, bright blue eyes, and a sturdy frame. Margaret's laughter was warm and contagious, though her backstory held sorrow. She had once lost a child in an orphanage fire decades ago, a tragedy that redirected her life toward advocacy. She guided children through art and music as pathways to healing. Emily, shy at first, found comfort among peers who also bore scars, visible and hidden. Max was allowed to accompany her, lying quietly in corners, occasionally padding over to nudge a crying child with his nose, drawing giggles and easing silence. It was Sister Margaret who encouraged Emily to perform again. Boston Symphony Hall is hosting a concert for children who have faced hardship. They want stories of courage, not perfection. Would you like to play? At first, Emily shook her head, fear gripping her chest. The memory of Melissa's scorn still whispered in her mind. But Max pressed his head against her lap, and Richard knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. But if you want to share your mother's music, I'll be there. We'll all be there." Weeks of preparation followed. Every afternoon, sunlight washed across the living room as Emily practiced, faltering at first, then growing steadier. Richard, though not a musician, sat patiently beside her, encouraging her with every note. Neighbors stopped by, pausing to listen through the open window. Mrs. Parker, the elderly neighbor who had once called the police, often brought cookies and whispered encouragement. "Play loud, child," she would say, "so the whole street knows you're free." The night of the concert arrived with a brisk winter chill. The grand facade of Boston Symphony Hall glowed under spotlights, its columns towering, its steps crowded with families, journalists, and patrons. Inside, the chandeliers sparkled against velvet seats. Richard wheeled Emily down the aisle toward the stage, Max walked proudly beside her, a red ribbon tied loosely around his neck as if he too were part of the performance. Backstage, Emily trembled. She wore a simple white dress, her hair tied back with a blue ribbon. Her hands hovered uncertainly over her lap. Richard knelt, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You don't have to be perfect. Just let the music carry you. And remember, your mom would be proud." Emily blinked back tears, nodded, and whispered, "Stay close." Max licked her hand, tail wagging, as though answering for both himself and her father. The hall darkened. A spotlight illuminated the center stage. Richard pushed Emily forward, each wheel creaking softly on the wooden floor. A hush fell across the audience. She positioned herself before the piano, her bandaged fingers trembling above the keys. For a heartbeat, silence pressed like a weight. Then Emily closed her eyes and began to play. The melody was the same her mother had once performed, gentle at first, then swelling with a depth far beyond her years. Every note seemed to wash away shadows, filling the hall with something luminous. The audience leaned forward, many dabbing tears from their eyes. Max lay at the edge of the stage, head on his paws, eyes half closed, as if he too was carried by the music. Richard sat in the front row, his vision blurred with tears. In the music, he saw Charlotte again, her smile, her grace, her love reflected in the daughter they had created together. Emily's final chord lingered like a benediction, then silence followed by thunderous applause. The entire hall rose in a standing ovation, the sound echoing like a storm of joy. Emily lifted her head, cheeks flushed, eyes shining. She bowed slightly, smiling through her tears. For the first time, she felt not broken, but whole. Later that evening, as the city lights twinkled across the Charles River, Richard carried Emily out of the hall, Max trotting beside them. Reporters called out, cameras flashed, but Emily leaned her head against her father's shoulder, exhausted yet radiant. "Daddy," she murmured, "I wasn't scared." Richard kissed her forehead, whispering, "You were brave." "You gave the world your song," Max barked once, sharp and proud, as if sealing the promise of a new life. That night in their warm little home, Emily fell asleep to the faint echoes of applause still ringing in her ears. Richard stood by the window, gazing out at the stars, and whispered into the night, "Charlotte, she shines because of you." Max sat quietly at his side, guardian of both memory and future, his eyes steady on the sleeping child. The melody of freedom and healing had begun, and this time it would not fade. In the end, Emily's journey was not only about escaping pain, but about discovering that even in the darkest nights, the light of love and the hand of God can still break through. The music she played was more than notes on a piano. It was a miracle, a reminder that God's grace can take broken pieces and turn them into something beautiful. Just as he placed Max by Emily's side as a guardian and stirred her father's heart to awaken at the right moment, he also watches over us in our everyday lives. Perhaps you too have walked through seasons of silence or suffering. Remember that God has not forgotten you. Miracles are not always grand. They may come through a loyal friend, a word of kindness, or the courage to try again. Emily's story teaches us that with faith, patience, and love, healing is possible and hope can be reborn. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from, or simply write Amen to show that you believe in the power of love, faith, and protection from above. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this story so that others may also find comfort and courage. May God bless you and your family, and may His miracles continue to shine in your daily life.